is natural man. One of the quiet goals of the Enlightenment was the disestablishment of churches and of Christianity. By its enthronement of nature and of natural law, it worked to supplant Christianity and God's law. In time, of course, natural law gave way to status law. The state was seen by Hegel as nature's supreme expression. A first step in this process of disestablishment was to reduce Christianity to an option for man, a matter of choice, not of necessity. The realm of necessity was held to be civil government. Freedom came to mean deliverance from the church to the state, from supernatural mandates and laws to quote-unquote natural and status laws. The Reformation had said plainly that biblical faith requires belief in God's predestination, in God's sovereign choice, whether or not men are elect or non-elect. This was reversed by the Enlightenment and then by Arminianism. Sovereign choice was transferred to man. Man, it was held, had the option to choose God or to reject him, to declare God to be elect or non-elect. Second, a logical consequence of this position was, for man, to reject the triune God and Christianity and to ban this faith as inimical, 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 as inimical to man and to free. Let's try that again. And to ban this faith as, quote, inimical to man and to a free, democratic or republican society. This step the French Revolution, and especially the Marquis de Sade, took boldly. Christianity holds this world to be a created order and therefore totally dependent upon the triune God. John 1:3 says of God the Word, quote, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. End quote. This absolute dependency is of the world upon God, not upon the Church. After Darwin especially, this dependency was denied, and instead men in the world order were seen as rather dependent on the state. Especially since World War II, there has been a steady growth of hostility to God and Christianity in the name of freedom. If the natural order is determinative, then any supernatural law or mandate is an infringement on human freedom. A ban on God's law is therefore sought. The issue is between supernatural man and natural man, between Jesus Christ and his new humanity, and the fallen Adam and his unregenerate humanity. In 1938, Eugen Rosenstock Hussey's Out of Revolution, the autobiography of Western man, was published. It was, in effect, an account of the great counter-revolution of the natural man against the supernatural man, Jesus Christ, and his new humanity. The Luther of this counter-revolution was a fictional character, Faust, in particular Goethe's Faust. Men sought a re-migration from Israel to nature, from a covenanted people to a natural one. They sought, in effect, an ark to take them back, unlike Noah, to the world before the flood, to a world where men lived very long lives in contempt of God. Quote, natural law bore the proud name of a sacrament. Pardon me for sniffing. Natural law bore the proud name of a sacrament, end quote. In the world of the Enlightenment, quote, the princes took over the functions of the popes, the successors of Peter, end quote. In this world of the natural man, the Bible is anathema, the state school textbook for sex education, changing bodies, changing lives, says in its opening pages, quote, there isn't any rule book. There's no right way or right age to have life experiences, end quote. There can, in this perspective, be no right nor wrong, because there can be no rule book, no Bible. Whatever is good is natural and therefore good. Evil is the anti-natural and therefore supernatural or Christian. Hitler is seen as evil simply by associating him with Christianity, even though he was an atheist, anti-Christian, and a nationalistic Marxist. The premise in schools... I got my mindset. The premise in school sex education classes is that there are no right or wrong answers, quote, just your answers, end quote. The textbook, Learning About Sex, states, quote, I cannot judge the rightness or wrongness of any of these behaviors. Instead, I hope that you can find the sexual lifestyle which is best for your life, end quote. Not surprisingly, many educators work to bar any teaching on biblical morality. Chastity is often a forbidden subject because it represents the standards of supernatural man. Before sex education spread through state schools in the 1970s, teenage pregnancy had been declining over a period of more than a dozen years, but it rose sharply with the introduction of sex education classes. Since the goal of such teaching was and is to further the triumph of natural man, it must be said that the results are desired results. As against the biblical view that humanity outside of Christ is fallen, totally depraved and in sin, the humanists assert the natural goodness, or at least moral neutrality of the natural man. Carl Rogers, very influential in these educational circles that enthrone the natural man, has held that necessary to sound education is, quote, a profound trust in the human organism, end quote. Values clarification teaching works to deliver the child from biblical laws into a totally personal and relativistic, quote-unquote, morality. As one teacher at least has insisted, is it right for you? No moral arbiter exists beyond the natural man. As a result, fornication, adultery, homosexuality and other lawless practices are affirmed to be natural and are promoted. Christian standards are derided and pure values are stressed. Such teachings are, as Sowell noted, quote, pretentious mush, end quote, but they are still poisonous in their pretensions. Their implicit goal is anarchy. If every man's values are valid in the sphere of sexual morality, why not follow Sad's logic in the spheres of theft and murder? Karl Marx rightly feared the logic of Max Stirner. Stirner saw that, given the truth of atheism, there could be no law governing man in any sphere. Every man would be his own law. The key sentence in Judges, repeated more than once, is, quote, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which is right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. Having rejected God as their king and lawgiver, every man was his own God, king, and law. Margaret Mead, who was hardly a friend of God and not at all favourable to a biblical faith, still observes, in a book very antithetical to Christianity, quote, the question of morality, of the public observance of declared standards of tolerable and intolerable forms of petty corruption, of the interaction between different systems of morality, loyalty and rake-off, present. Itchy nose. Why is my nose so itchy, baby? Got an itchy nose for you. Present an acute problem to our independent... Flappity, flappity, flap. Present an acute problem to our interdependent world in many ways. Social life is based on the trustworthiness of others in the same system, end quote. She saw the need for some common ground, but she sought it in man, end quote, the trustworthiness of others in the same system. End quote. This trustworthiness has been singularly lacking. It has been abundantly evident, especially since World War II and the decline of attention to biblical law, that men and nations are not trustworthy. What sanctions, then, can the nations provide against, quote, intolerable, end quote, actions on the part of men and nations? The United Nations has been the answer, and military coercion, but in terms of what moral standard? Repeated evils have been routinely overlooked, while action has been taken in other cases on political grounds. The United Nations has not advanced morality because it has none. Its existence, moreover, is a contradiction. If the natural man is normative, then why should there be nation-states or a world state? The earlier anarchists were logical. If nature is normative and man is naturally good, then the state in a If nature is normative and man is naturally good, then the state is an obstruction to a free, happy and prosperous social order. Indeed, for these anarchists, there were and are two impediments to the free and happy society. First, of course, there is Christianity, with its insistence on supernatural man and its negative view of natural man. The freedom of man, it was held, requires the elimination of Christianity. Second, there's the state. Because it introduces coercion into human action, it prevents freedom and therefore is an enemy of natural man. The anarchists, however, lacked the honesty of the Marquis de Sade because they assumed the natural goodness of man. They gave man a moral nature, and in this respect they were still in the fold of Christianity because they assumed that men have a moral nature. The concept of natural man, however, requires what we believe with Nietzsche, that man must awaken to the fact that God is dead and we must live beyond good and evil. I'm going to sneeze. Or am I? Hard to tell. Earlier, the Marquis de Sade had vindicated every crime conceivable as valid because it occurred in nature. Nothing, therefore, could be condemned without giving assent to the standards of supernatural man. To condemn anything in the world of nature as evil is, logically, a heresy for humanism. It's like saying that some aspect of the biblical God is evil. It leads to a radical collapse of whatever faith it is that adopts such a position. It has often been pointed out that the Marquis de Sade did not practice as many perversions as were routine among the aristocracy of his day. Of course, he was in prison too much of his life to be able to do so. In his writings, however, he was insistently logical in stating that to believe in natural man means to accept all practices other than those governed by the supernatural God and His Word as acceptable. No ground exists for natural man to condemn any natural human act on extraneous grounds. Every natural act is its own justification. No standard outside the act is permissible. Max Stirner agreed with this. He wrote in The Ego and His Own, quote, "Take notice how a, quote, moral man, end quote, behaves, who today often thinks he is through with God and throws off Christianity as a bygone thing. If you ask him whether he has ever doubted that the copulation of brother and sister is incest, that monogamy is the truth of marriage, that filial piety is a sacred duty, etc., then a moral shudder will come over him at the conception of one being allowed to touch his sister as wife also, etc. And whence this shudder? Because he believes in those moral commandments. This moral faith is deeply rooted in his breast. Much as he rages against the pious Christians, he himself has nevertheless as thoroughly remained a Christian, to wit, a moral Christian. In the form of morality, Christianity holds him a prisoner, and a prisoner under faith. Monogamy is to be something sacred, and he who may live in bigamy is punished as a criminal. He who commits incest suffers as a criminal. Those who are always crying that religion is not to be regarded in the state and the Jew is to be a citizen equally with the Christian show themselves in accord with this. Is not this incest and monogamy a dogma of faith? Touch it, and you will learn by experience how this moral man is a hero of faith too, not less than Krummacher, not less than Philip II. These fight for the faith of the church. Of the church, the people, the church. These fight for the faith of the church, he for the faith of the state, or the moral laws of the state. For articles of faith both condemn him who acts otherwise than their faith will allow. The brand of crime is stamped upon him, and he may languish in reformatories and jails. Moral faith is as fanatical as religious faith. They call that, quote, liberty of faith, end quote, then, when brother and sister, on account of a relation that they should have settled with their, quote, conscience, end quote, are thrown into prison. Quote, but they said a pernicious palaba boo boo. I don't like it. But they set a pernicious example, end quote. Yes, indeed, others might have taken the notion that the state had no business to meddle with their relation, and thereupon, quote, purity of morals, end quote, would go to ruin. So then, the religious heroes of faith are zealous for the, quote, sacred God, end quote, the moral ones for the, quote, sacred good, end quote, end quote. If we understand what Stirner held, then we can grasp the direction and meaning of sex education in our state schools, of the arguments used by homosexuals in demanding their version of life. That wasn't very clear, was it?
No, I think you're right. It was very clear.
In demanding their version of life, and we can understand why more and more judges are delivering decisions after the manner of SAD. A homosexual San Francisco, California supervisor has declared, quote, this campaign is a spiritual war, end quote. If we establish society on the premises of natural man, then it follows, as the California Court of Appeals held in 1991, that sodomy is a constitutional right. The State Supreme Court held the issue to be unresolved until the scope of, quote, the right to privacy, end quote, could be determined. However, given the prevailing premise of the priority of the natural man, if not the exclusivism of the natural, the homosexual faith will prevail unless the priority of the supernatural man, Jesus Christ and his law word, are re-established and extended. Okay. That was all right. Wasn't too bad. Mic is a bit bright or hot or whatever, but the waveform is pretty. Okay, well, let's continue on, shall we? Chapter 3. Sadean Man as God. The world of the Marquis de Sade is all around us. It is so powerful that a monthly such as the World and I, October 1993, devoted 46 pages to the analysis of... Freudian slip. Only joking. Devoted 46 pages to the analysis of, quote, homosexuality, new virtue or old vice. The editor, left unnamed, confronted the issue realistically, declaring, quote, "The great social barrier to homosexuality is the family. As long as the family, as now understood, commands the commands the rational and emotional assent of most people, it is hard for homosexuality to enter the mainstream of American life." End quote. Until now, the family has been the basis of civilizations. The editor considers the question of whether or not the family is ultimately biological or social, recognizes both elements, and sees its historical development as basically social. The religious, the biblical character of the family is bypassed. This is to confuse the issue. The Hebrew and Christian families have seen theirs as a God-ordained order, and homosexuality as the antithesis of this, and therefore punishable by death. Leviticus 18:22, 20:13, Deuteronomy 23:17, 1 Kings 14:24, Romans 1:24-32, etc. However, thorough analysis of this question is inadequate as long as we bypass the religious question. The Bible sees homosexuality as an offense against God's fundamental order and as the burning out of man. The translation in Romans 1:27, burned, is literally burned out. The violation of the image of God in man is so great in male and female homosexuals that it is their burning out. The editor sees the first or primary function of the family as biological, to produce children and, quote, to raise, end quote, or rear them. You raise animals, you don't rear animals, you see. Yeah, sure, but if science realizes the dream of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World to produce babies in a test tube, will that eliminate the family? A biological or a social function can be altered almost to the point of elimination, but not so a religious one. The editor is not hostile to the religious, but he is somewhat indifferent to it. He sees, however, as a given that homosexuals, quote, I'm just going to bring this mic down. It's, it's a bit too... Yeah. Try that again. Have the rights of any citizen, end quote. This means a failure to recognize the radical hostility between orthodox biblical faith and homosexuals. Thomas J. Ward and Frederick A. Swartz write on, quote, the mainstreaming of homosexuality, end quote. Their main thesis is that it has not been shown that homosexuality is either genetic or immutable. More scientific research is necessary before changes in the social... More scientific research is necessary before changes into social... Cooler jets. It's all right. More scientific research is necessary before changes in social policy are made. Their reliance is thus on scientific research rather than religious and moral absolutes. After all, if we believe in an evolutionary perspective, the scientific facts can change. We can add that precisely because we have looked to scientific answers, we are in the crisis that exists. God's word is unchanging. The stance of psychiatrists was changed by means of pressure tactics. Even more now, politics is at work. Both Republicans and Democrats responded to homosexual pressures, and President President Klingon Black Rock. Pressures, and President Clinton has championed their cause. More than a usual number of male and female homosexuals, quote, glorify, end quote, his administration. Governments, media and business are cooperative with homosexuals, and the mainline churches, in varying degrees, are also receptive. Of course, the pressure and the threats are substantial. Schoolbooks are more openly anti-Christian and pro-homosexual. Toleration and acceptance of homosexuality and other deviant practices are now part of a statist education. One aspect of the war against Christian premises is the argument from science. Some have insisted on a genetic basis for homosexuality. Others maintain that it's a matter of choice, and it is a choice as valid as any other in a value-free world. The quote-unquote scientific studies are suspect, as are the various pro-homosexual scholars who continue to use the clearly invalid figures of the Kinsey Report. What is clear is that even before AIDS, homosexuals had a poor life expectancy. Also, the legal acceptance of homosexuality has opened the door to demands for the legalization of a variety of other practices such as paedophilia, bestiality, and incest. The perspective of Ward and Swartz is obviously not biblical. They see the past treatment of homosexuals as, quote, cold, insensitive, end quote, and they believe that they should be treated, quote, in a responsible, compassionate manner, end quote. Should we also... I'm going to pause it there. Okay, take a little thing. Took a little break there. Be back. So, let's hit the record button. Should we treat rapists and murderers with compassion also? Is this an issue for compassion or for justice? If homosexuals are at the least a health problem in the population, is it insensitive or unjust to recognize this? If they are a factor in the sexual abuse of the young, is it unjust to analyze and deal with that fact? And what about the compassion towards the many? The compassion. All right. Gonna got my cushion on there, but too much echoey eck. And what about compassion towards the many young victims of homosexuals? Ward and Swartz recognize that homosexuals are demanding, quote, much more than respect and tolerance, end quote. Is the answer to this demand that we accept the normalcy of homosexuality and, quote, the exploring of the scientific validity thereof, end quote? Do religion and morality have nothing to do with the matter? Is not this pseudo-neutralism as wrong as homosexuality? The World and I gives no space to the biblical position, but it does give 12 pages to Franklin E. Kameny, a, quote, gay activist, end quote, writing on, quote, deconstructing the traditional family, end quote. Kameny has served on the District of Columbia Commission on Human Rights and the board of the District of Columbia American Civil Liberties Union. Kameny's belief is in freedom in moral matters, which he sees as basic to the First Amendment. He insists that the burden of proof in limiting any kind of sexual activity rests with those who seek such limitations. But if no religious or moral grounds are acceptable, how can such a proof be forthcoming? By definition, a biblical standard is excluded. Kameny begins by questioning the validity of the biblical doctrine of the family, although he does not discuss the Bible. He insists on, quote, the priority of the individual, end quote. But if the individual is prior to God or society, how can there be any law? He states, quote, society is a cultural artifact that has no legitimacy in its own right, and no, quote, rights, end quote, to which the interest of the individual need properly be subordinated. Illustratively, Illustratively. Illustratively. Illustratively, let the readers ask and answer, why does society exist at all? Or for what purpose does society exist? Or, a little less neutrally, what excuse does society have for existing? The answer is, of course, that society exists solely to enable its members, as individuals, to lead better and more rewarding, fulfilling, and satisfying lives that they could without the assistance of society. There is no other reason for having a society. End quote. In a debate with John Lofton, Kameny argued for the legitimacy of bestiality. Kameny believes that society exists for the same reason as automobiles do, quote, to serve our purposes, end quote. There is thus, quote, no legitimate basis, end quote, for limiting the individual's freedom. Quote, above all, the First Amendment creates an inescapable moral relativism for our whole nation, end quote. No moral code is thus tenable. He sees our society falsely guided by the, quote, so-called Judeo-Christian religious precepts, end quote. This religious heritage cripples and binds our culture, and the obsolete, outmoded standards should be discarded. Quote, thus, the First Amendment creates an inescapable moral relativism, societal and cultural, for our nation taken as a whole. For example, I view homosexual sexual activity as not only immoral or sinful or wrong or undesirable, but as affirmatively moral and virtuous and right and desirable. I take that as a moral absolute, and churches, Christian churches at that, with which I have some association, take the same view. I am not willing to concede that my moral absolutes are less I am not willing to concede that my moral absolutes are any less. I am not willing to concede that my moral absolutes are any less absolute than those of more orthodox religions that take an opposing view, nor indeed I in America. End quote. I hate the fact that I waste time on it. For Kameny, freedom is the moral absolute, which means that anything goes. In terms of his absolute freedom, how can he limit it by stating that anything goes, provided that the other person is not hurt? How can that counter-standard be introduced? The goal of some is to lower the age of consent for children. Kinsey saw no harm in child molestation. Where are the limits? The individual and his freedom have no limits when made into an absolute. Kameny sees murder as an imposition on a non-consenting partner. Even then he writes, quote, as a matter of philosophical principle, a government prohibiting murder needs, at some threshold point in the process, to have shouldered the burden of justification for its prohibition. End quote. On what grounds? Kameny does not say. For him, man has an, quote, inalienable right, end quote, to be free to do as he pleases. For Kameny, the auth freedom. I don't think it should say that, but I'm going to read it anyway. For Kameny, the auth freedom of the individual is radically uninhibited in theory. For him, this radical freedom, quote, is what America is all about, end quote. Editor Morton A. Kaplan tries, quote, to apply some common sense to these issues, end quote. He says, he avoids the religious foundation, of course. He recognizes that a culture Kampf is in process, but he refuses to confront it religiously. As a result, we have a series of compromising statements. He wants to approve of the decriminalisation of homosexual activities, but not their full legitimation. Sexual activities, but not their full legitimation. Kaplan doubts that any, quote, real expert, end quote, on the subject exists, but he will not consider a return to biblical faith. My tongue is maybe giving out in me. But he will not consider a return to biblical faith. As a result, he is unable to deal with Kameni's arguments. Where does all this lead? The English Weekly Telegraph, issue number 113, September 8th to 14th, 1993, carried the obituary of Anne Cummings, writer and actress, and the author of erotic travelogues. Born on December 14th, 1917, she died in 1993 at the age of 75. She had been diagnosed HIV positive 7 years previously. She had acted in films and had taught at the Michael Chekhov Drama Studio. She was the granddaughter of a noted MP, was educated in schools in England and abroad, and had resided in England, Switzerland, South Africa, and the United States. She was described as a, quote, sexual adventuress, end quote, and she wrote about her experiences. Quote, Cummings recalled a night in Paris where she stood in a street dressed only in a mink coat and fluffy slippers, baring her body to passing men. No one stopped. End quote. The same page of the Weekly Telegraph carries the obituary of the Anglican Bishop George Appleton, who, when he retired, said he was going to, quote, prepare myself for the migration to the new order of being which cannot be far ahead, end quote. Anne Cummings and Bishop George Appleton belonged to an older generation, born with the trappings of civilization clinging to them. The new barbarians share the mindless perspective. They are relativists and Sadeans. No society nor state can long exist with such barbarians in its midst. No society nor state can long exist with such barbarians in its midst. Basic to all their activity is an implicit and explicit belief that the will of the individual is the only law. No jungle is more deadly than the modern state and city. We see all around us the logic of man's fall, of Genesis 3:5, every man as his own God and law, doing that which is right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. Okay, well, that was a reasonable time. I'm a bit tired now. It's the old brain function's going downhill. It's 8:15 of the P to the M. So, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. And I'm going to shut down the booth for tonight. Do a little bit of housekeeping, and Bob's your uncle. So thanks for being here. Again, if you want to support the work, you can go to nathanteacher.com, click on the donate button, and you can either give monthly or a one-off gift. So God bless, and hope to